November 6th, 1914. The Shat al-Arab waterway. A gray dawn breaks over the Persian Gulf as 14 British warships emerge from the morning haze, their guns trained on a crumbling Ottoman fortress at Fao. On the decks stand 6,000 soldiers of the Indian Expeditionary Force, rifles loaded, bayonets fixed, waiting for an order that will change the Middle East forever. The official dispatch from London describes their mission in the language of empire, to protect British interests against Turkish hostility. But the men standing on those decks have not been told what those interests are. They have not been shown the contracts. They have not seen the maps marked with pipeline routes instead of battle lines. They believe they are soldiers. In truth, they are collection agents sent to secure an asset their government cannot afford to lose. 300 miles to the east, on the Persian coast, smoke rises from the chimneys of the Abadan refinery. It is an industrial cathedral, a maze of pipes and tanks and distillation towers sprawling across the mudflats where the Karun River meets the Gulf. At this moment, Abadan processes more crude oil than any facility in the world. Its storage tanks hold enough petroleum to fuel the Royal Navy for months. Its export jetties load tankers bound for Portsmouth, Gibraltar, and Singapore. And every single barrel that flows through its gates belongs to a single company, controlled by a single government, dependent on a single supply line that runs within artillery range of Ottoman territory. The invasion of Mesopotamia was never about defeating the Turks. It was about protecting the pipes. To understand why British soldiers would spend 4 years dying in the deserts of Iraq, while their brothers bled in the trenches of France, you must travel back to a boardroom in London 2 years before the war began. You must understand a decision made not by generals, but by a young politician who saw the future more clearly than his rivals, and who was willing to bet his nation survival on a resource it did not possess. In the spring of 1912, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was 37 years old, ambitious beyond measure, and convinced that the next war would be won or lost at sea. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he commanded the most powerful navy in human history, 700 warships, 250,000 sailors, bases spanning every ocean on Earth. The Royal Navy had ruled the waves for a century through a simple formula. British ships burned British coal, mined from British soil, transported on British rails. The fleet was an extension of British geography. Its dominance was written into the geology of the island itself. But Churchill saw cracks in this foundation. Germany was building a new fleet, faster and more modern than anything Britain possessed. The Kaiser's dreadnoughts were narrowing the gap, and Churchill calculated that within a decade, numerical superiority alone would not be enough. Britain needed an edge, a technological advantage that could not be copied or purchased, and he believed he had found it in a thick black substance that seeped from the earth in places most Englishmen could not locate on a map. Oil burned hotter than coal. Oil required fewer men to handle. An oil-fired warship could refuel at sea, extend its range by thousands of miles, and accelerate fast enough to dictate the terms of engagement. The numbers were irresistible. A battleship converted from coal to oil could be lighter, faster, and more heavily armed while carrying the same amount of fuel. Churchill did not see this as an incremental improvement. He saw it as the difference between victory and extinction. But there was a problem that no amount of engineering could solve. Britain had no oil. Not a single proven reserve of commercial significance existed anywhere in the British Isles or its self-governing dominions. To convert the Royal Navy to petroleum was to convert it to dependence. It was to place the most powerful military instrument on Earth at the mercy of foreign geology, foreign governments, and foreign corporations whose loyalty could not be guaranteed. This is where the money enters the story. And the money, as always, had arrived first. In 1901, a British financier named William Knox Darcy had traveled to Persia with a suitcase full of cash and a contract that would reshape the 20th century. The Shah of Persia, Muzaffar ad-Din, was bankrupt. His treasury was empty, his army unpaid, his creditors circling like wolves. Darcy offered him a lifeline, £20,000 in cash, another £20,000 in company shares, and 16% of future profits, in exchange for the exclusive right to explore, extract, and export petroleum from an area covering nearly 500,000 square miles. The Shah signed within weeks. He had no geological surveys, no understanding of what might lie beneath his kingdom, no leverage to demand better terms. He needed money today. Darcy was offering money today. The future could take care of itself. For 7 years, Darcy's drilling teams found nothing but dust and debt. The venture hemorrhaged capital. Investors fled. By 1908, Darcy was preparing to abandon the concession entirely when his final drilling crew, working in the Zagros Mountains at a site called Masjid-i-Suleiman, struck oil. The gusher that erupted from the Persian earth did not merely save Darcy's investment. It announced the birth of a new world order, one in which power would flow not from coal seams or gold reserves, but from the control of petroleum. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was incorporated within months. Its shares soared on the London Stock Exchange. Its pipelines began snaking across the Persian landscape toward a refinery complex rising from the mud at Abadan. And, in the corridors of Whitehall, men who had never given a moment's thought to Persia began studying maps with new intensity. Here was oil, vast, proven, accessible, controlled by a British company in a region where British influence was already strong. The question was no longer whether Britain would convert to petroleum. The question was who would control the terms. Charles Greenway was not a patriot. He was the chairman of Anglo-Persian, and he understood leverage better than any admiral. His company had what the Royal Navy needed. The Royal Navy had what his shareholders wanted: guaranteed contracts, stable prices, and government investment in infrastructure that Anglo-Persian could not afford to build alone. When Churchill came calling in 1913, seeking a long-term supply agreement that would secure Britain's energy future, Greenway did not salute and offer favorable terms. He negotiated like a man holding four aces. The discussions that followed were not conducted between allies. They were conducted between a buyer who could not walk away and a seller who knew it. Anglo-Persian demanded everything: guaranteed purchases at fixed prices, government financing for pipelines and tankers, and most importantly, a direct equity stake that would bind the British state to the company's fortunes. Churchill could bluster about national security, but Greenway had the geology. The oil was in Persia, not Portsmouth. The leverage was not subject to debate. In June 1914, 1 month before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for £2 million. It was the largest single investment the British state had ever made in a private enterprise. Parliament approved the deal after a single day of debate, swayed by Churchill's soaring rhetoric about strategic necessity and national survival. What the members were not told, what the newspapers did not report, was the escape clause buried in the contract as fine print. If Anglo-Persian supply lines were ever severed by war, sabotage, or political instability, the company's obligations to the Admiralty would be suspended. Britain had not purchased energy independence, it had purchased exposure. The contract was signed on June 17, 1914. 11 days later, a Serbian nationalist shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo. When war erupted in August, the Ottoman Empire remained neutral. For 3 months, British strategists debated whether to court Constantinople or confront it. The arguments for diplomacy were compelling. The Ottomans controlled the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. An alliance with the Sultan could open a supply route to Russia, relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, and potentially shorten the war by years. The Foreign Office favored engagement. The War Office counseled patience. But in the Admiralty, different calculations were being made. If the Ottomans joined Germany, they would gain the legal and military capacity to contest Anglo-Persian's concession. Ottoman forces could strike at the pipeline that crossed the mountains from Masjid-i-Suleiman to Abadan. Ottoman agents could arm the tribes who lived along the route. Ottoman lawyers could challenge the validity of a contract signed by a deposed Shah's bankrupt predecessor. Everything Churchill had built, the oil-fired fleet, the government stake, the supply agreements, could be rendered worthless by a single successful raid on a pumping station. The decision to invade Mesopotamia was made before the Ottomans entered the war. The transport ships were loaded in Bombay in October. The expeditionary force assembled at Bahrain, waiting for an order that would come regardless of what Constantinople decided. When Ottoman warships bombarded Russian ports on October 29th, London had its pretext. Britain declared war on November 5th. The landing at Fao commenced on November 6th. This was not a response to aggression. It was a preemptive seizure of collateral. The campaign that followed would become one of the longest and most catastrophic of the entire war. British and Indian troops advanced up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, seizing Basra, then Amara, then Kut al-Amara, always pushing north toward Baghdad, always stretching their supply lines thinner, always underestimating the resistance they would face. The official objective was the defeat of Ottoman forces in the region. The actual objective was the pipeline. The pipeline ran north. In December 1915, a British force of 13,000 men became trapped at Kut, besieged by Ottoman troops who had learned to fight in the desert while their enemies died of heat and disease. For 5 months, the garrison held out, waiting for relief that never came. When General Charles Townshend finally surrendered in April 1916, it was the largest capitulation of British forces since the American Revolution. The prisoners were marched across the desert to camps in Anatolia. Fewer than half survived. The public was told these men died defending civilization against the Turk. They were told the campaign was necessary to protect India, to secure the Persian Gulf, to uphold the honor of the empire. What they were not told was that the siege of Kut had accomplished its strategic purpose long before the surrender. The pipeline was secure. The refinery at Abadan was operating at full capacity. The oil was flowing. The men who died at Kut were not casualties of military failure. They were carrying costs written off against future profits. By 1918, British forces controlled all of Mesopotamia. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and in its death throes, a new map was being drawn. not by generals or diplomats, but by oil executives, bankers, and contract lawyers. The Sykes-Picot Agreement had already divided the region into spheres of influence. France would receive Syria and Lebanon. Britain would receive Palestine, Jordan, and the 3 Ottoman provinces that would soon be fused into a single artificial nation, Iraq. The British did not conquer Iraq. They manufactured it. They drew borders that had never existed, uniting the Sunni north, the Shia south, and the Kurdish mountains into an administrative fiction designed for extraction, not governance. They installed a king, Faisal ibn Hussein, who had never set foot in Mesopotamia before his coronation, who spoke the wrong dialect, who represented no one except the British officials who placed the crown on his head. They drafted a constitution that proclaimed Iraqi sovereignty while reserving all subsoil mineral rights for British concessionaires. They called it independence. It was a leveraged buyout. The League of Nations granted Britain a mandate over Iraq in 1920, a legal framework that allowed colonial control to continue under the language of international trusteeship. When Iraqi tribes revolted against this arrangement, the Royal Air Force responded with bombs and poison gas. Winston Churchill, now colonial secretary, authorized the use of chemical weapons against villages that resisted British administration. In his memos, he expressed irritation at colleagues who found this distasteful. He could not understand their squeamishness. These were, after all, uncivilized peoples. The Iraq Petroleum Company, formally established in 1929, would control Iraqi oil production for the next 4 decades. Its shareholders included Anglo-Persian, Royal Dutch Shell, French interests, and eventually American corporations seeking their share of the prize. The Iraqi government received royalties, a percentage of the value of its own resources, extracted by foreign companies, processed in foreign refineries, sold on foreign markets at prices set by foreign boards. Every barrel of oil that left Iraqi soil enriched London and New York and Paris before a single dinar reached Baghdad. This was Churchill's true legacy in the Middle East, not the conquest of territory, but the conquest of geology, not the defeat of enemies, but the signing of contracts. The conversion of the Royal Navy to oil had created a dependency. The invasion of Iraq had militarized that dependency, and the mandate system had laundered the entire arrangement into something resembling legitimacy. Britain did not steal Iraq's oil. Britain created a legal structure in which Iraq's oil could be sold to Britain at prices Britain helped set, under terms Britain helped draft. Enforced by weapons Britain supplied. The echoes of this arrangement would reverberate for a century. When Iraqi nationalists overthrew the British-backed monarchy in 1958, they inherited a nation designed for extraction, a nation whose borders made no ethnic or religious sense, whose institutions served foreign investors whose economy depended on a single commodity it did not control. When Saddam Hussein nationalized the oil industry in 1972, he was reversing decisions made in London boardrooms 50 years before. When American and British forces invaded Iraq in 2003, they traveled roads first paved by the Indian Expeditionary Force, secured wells first drilled by Anglo-Persian engineers, occupied a country first assembled by Winston Churchill's colonial office. The faces changed. The flags changed. The pipeline routes remained the same. History does not remember the Mesopotamian campaign as a resource war. The textbooks speak of imperial rivalry and strategic necessity, of the defense of India and the protection of British interests. The memorials list the names of the dead without explaining what they died for. The 92,000 British and Indian soldiers who fell in Mesopotamia are honored as heroes who served their country. They are not remembered as instruments of corporate policy, as enforcers of contracts they never signed, as casualties of a balance sheet they never saw. Winston Churchill would go on to lead Britain through its finest hour, to stand against fascism when the world wavered, to become the symbol of democratic courage in the 20th century. His wartime speeches would be memorized by schoolchildren. His face would adorn currency. His legacy would be carved in stone. None of this erases what happened in Iraq. None of this changes the nature of the transaction. A young politician, desperate to modernize his navy, made a wager that bound his nation to a region it did not understand through a resource it could not produce at a price paid by soldiers who would never share in the profits. He called it strategy. He called it vision. He called it the cost of remaining a great power in a world that ran on oil. The soldiers who landed at Fao believed they were fighting a war. They were not wrong. But the war they fought was not the war they understood. The enemy was not the Ottoman Empire. The enemy was exposure. Exposure to supply disruption, to price volatility, to the terrifying possibility that the machines of war might fall silent for want of fuel. The victory they won was not measured in territory captured or enemies defeated. It was measured in barrels per day, in contract renewals, in quarterly reports delivered to shareholders who had never heard of cut. Iraq did not become a nation in 1920. It became a balance sheet, and the debts incurred in its creation are still being paid in blood.